So right now in Florida, there is a high-profile recount going in for both Mayor, or I should say not Mayor, but uh, Governor Ron DeSantis versus Andrew Gillum. That race has not been called yet. Now, originally, of course, Gillum had conceded, but now, since there is an automatic recount in play, nobody's been declared the winner. The other race, of course, is Rick Scott versus Bill Nelson. So it's very interesting in Florida that they're actually doing an official recount. That means the votes are incredibly close, and it could end up turning Florida blue, which would be a huge setback for Republicans. So now, of course, Rick Scott and backed up by Donald Trump are now saying the voter fraud. The Democrats are trying to steal the election. They're trying to steal it. Well, what proof do they have? None. They have no proof. Of course, that doesn't stop them from saying that. But now, of course, a Florida circuit judge is joining in and saying, we have looked at fraud. We have found no evidence of fraud whatsoever. And so the recount can continue. Now, this is Florida Circuit Chief Judge Jack Tudor. Now, he said, look, when it comes to Broward County, which is, of course, what Rick Scott and Marco Rubio and all these different Republicans are focusing in on, they're saying there must be rampant voter fraud here because as they keep counting votes, the votes keep stacking up towards Nelson and Gillum. Well, that's kind of what happens when you count all the votes. I mean, look, that's what happens there. Broward, of course, went for Gillum, and right now those vote totals are closing the gap. Now, will it be enough for Nelson and Gillum to pull out a win? I don't necessarily know, but it is very close. Now, of course, I want to go to a tweet here from Donald Trump here. First, he says, Mayor Gillum conceded on election day, and now Broward County has put him back into play. Bill Nelson conceded election, now he's back in play. This is an embarrassment to our country and to democracy. No, that's the opposite. This is actual democracy. Counting all the votes is incredibly democratic. I know, right? That's the essence of democracy, is making sure that everybody's vote gets counted. And letting the result sit where it sits. Now, I think it was a mistake, of course, for Gillum to concede, but then as they started to get closer and closer to a recount, Gillum's like, oh shit, I could actually win this. So he unconceded. And so did Bill. Well, Bill Nelson didn't concede either. So he's been fighting this as well. And as I said before, this recount could be a huge deal. Now, to go back to an article here from Axios, despite his claim, the president has presented no evidence that officials are attempting to rig the election in favor of Democratic candidates. No shit. Rick Scott, the Republican Senate candidate, is suing Broward County Supervisor of Elections and accusing officials of withholding information on the number of outstanding ballots in the Senate race. Under state law, recount is required when the winning margin is within 0.5% or less. Gillum is currently behind gubernatorial opponent Ron DeSantis by 0.47. And this was, of course, this report from Axios was compiled on Monday. So I'm assuming the numbers are still fairly current. And 0.47, that's real close, but not as close as Bill Nelson being behind Rick Scott. That is 0.2%, or 20%. Sorry. Numbers are hard. Anyway, so now that is fascinating. They're incredibly close. Just imagine if there were enough votes in Broward. And that's what Republicans are worried about. That's why they want to stop the recount. That's why they're like shitting their pants. Because they're like, is there enough votes in Broward to put Gillum over the top? To put Nelson over the top? And again, I don't know, but we have to make sure that all the votes are counted. Now, if it turns out that they don't get enough, then that's fine. But if they do, well, look, Republicans are already screaming voter fraud. Now, let me tell you something. What they're saying is voter fraud would actually be electoral fraud. If they're saying that the Democrats are rigging the election, well, then that's not voter fraud, that's electoral fraud. And I guess it would depend on how they're doing it. But I expect to hear more of the same Republican tropes. Oh, they're bringing people in from other places, or they're letting dead people vote and register, and that's why we need more voter ID, and that's how they're trying to steal the election. But as the judge said before, there's no evidence of that. It is empty bullshit. And it's there to try to delegitimize this election no matter what happens. And so, look, if it turns out that DeSantis and Scott do win, did actually have more votes, well, then that's the end of that's the end of the voter fraud narrative. Because then they're going to be like, oh no, well, we won, so voter fraud, sweep it under the rug. Well, what are you talking about? We didn't actually allege voter fraud. We thought maybe, but if you can be certain, if DeSantis loses, well, then you're going to hear a lot about voter fraud. So, and that in itself is the fraud. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a patreon.com/TYTNation set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.